And don't forget, you can always catch us online. Watch the show at GreatPlainsNews.com. GreatPlainsNews.com. And watch for the recap on a cable access station near you.
This is Dale Wetzel. This is the Legislature Today radio program. We're coming to you from the Peacock Alley American Bar and Grill in downtown Bismarck, North Dakota. It's a wonderful place to have a drink and a meal or both. If you are so inclined, it's in downtown Bismarck. It has a wonderful historic atmosphere. In fact, the legislature at one time met in this very building after the Capitol burned in the late 1920s. And so it has there's a lot of history here, and it's on the walls, and it's kind of suffused throughout the building, and it's a place you'd like to check out. And plus, the food and drinks are excellent, and they've been a gracious host to our program since its inception. We have as our guests in the second half hour of the Legislature Today, we have Mr. Lynn Helms, who's the director of the Department of Mineral Resources for the state of North Dakota. The Department of Mineral Resources is under the North Dakota Industrial Commission, and it is the state oil and gas regulatory agency. The Industrial Commission is the governor, the attorney general, and the agriculture commissioner. So you have three elected officials as the overseers of state oil and gas regulation in North Dakota. We also have Mr. Troy Coons, who's the vice chairman of the Northwest Landowners Association, which has been representing landowner interests in the legislature. Welcome, gentlemen.
Nice to be here, Dale.
Mr. Helms, one of the bills in the legislature has dealt with the reclamation of pipelines that are no longer used. Could you tell us, to what extent is pipeline reclamation an issue of urgency?
The time of the Bakken boom, it was a relatively small problem, albeit issue that we had to deal with because we dealt with finite, fairly small oil fields that covered a defined area, and the pipelines were sort of generally known where they were. They were within those oil fields, but we've now set out to construct an oil field the size of the state of West Virginia. If you bring Montana in, it's the size of the state of South Carolina. So we now are going to have a gathering and transportation or transfer pipeline system that will probably exceed 30,000 miles of underground pipelines. So it's become very apparent to everybody that we need to move into a realm where those pipelines not only have reclamation standards for what happens at the end of their life, but that there's some construction standards put in place for how those pipelines are going to be built. That's never existed before. There hasn't been any regulation really of the gathering and transfer pipelines.
And what you mentioned construction standards. Are there just generic construction standards that these companies follow in installing pipelines?
Well, yeah, there are. I mean, it goes company by company, basically, in terms of how they want to have their pipeline built and the material standards. There are standards for the materials that are set out by ASTM and API, but it's just been company by company as to what depth they wanted to put the pipelines at and pressure testing and that sort of thing. And that's what we're anticipating coming up in a rulemaking, is putting some of those standards down in the administrative code so that we've got some consistent depths and the way the pipelines are buried and that sort of thing.
What sources do you rely upon in deciding what the state standards are going to be?
Well, Dale, I think we're going to initially rely on other states. There are some other states that have adopted standards for installing these types of pipelines. And we're members of the Groundwater Protection Council, the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, the Energy Council. So North Dakota's got some good resources to go to. Our brothers and sisters in Alaska and different places to look at what kind of standards they've put in place. We did that when we adopted seismic or geophysical rules. We went to Wyoming, who already had rules, and looked at theirs and then adapted them to North Dakota.
Oh, I imagine when we're talking about pipeline construction and laying, we're talking about doing this across federal land, across state land, across Indian tribal land, across private land. What sort of dynamic does this create when you have all these different landowners, and maybe these different landowners have different standards as to how they would like pipelines buried beneath their turf?
Well, with the existing system, as you stated, you got all these different types of landowners, and every one of them has ownership or trust responsibility for the owners and a different set of standards. And so you're into a system that's very chaotic and changes mile by mile as you put that pipe in the ground. We're going to try to bring some standardization and some definition to that, so that the people that come in to build pipelines, the people that come in to dig pipelines into the ground, the people that do that reclamation after that pipe is buried and you got to restore the vegetation on top, they've got some reliable standards and some dependability and some understanding of what the rules are. Right now, it's owner by owner.
Are there pipeline reclamation standards in North Dakota right now?
There are no pipeline reclamation standards in place in North Dakota right now. There is one line within the Department of Mineral Resources reclamation standard about making sure that remaining underground pipelines are flushed with water before they're abandoned.
Do you have and first of all, what are pipelines used for? I mean, we talk about oil pipelines, gas pipelines, but I imagine they're used for like water and wastewater. What are they used for?
Sure. Well, you hit on the big ones: oil gathering, natural gas gathering. Natural gas gathering pipelines put the flares out. The oil gathering pipelines get the diesel trucks off the road. But the biggest one that we're looking at in the future is saltwater transfer lines. Saltwater causes the most permanent form of damage that you can do to soil. And so those standards are going to be by far the most important ones that we put in place.
And how long do you think that these rules will take to put in place, and when do you intend to start doing that?
Well, the rulemaking process is not easy. It's a minimum 10 months. That's kind of what we're anticipating. And we generally kick that off in late June or early July. So we anticipate having rules in place April of next year.
Do you have the folks that you need to have on staff, or either now or being authorized by the legislature presently, to keep track of pipeline regulation in a manner that you would like?
We're getting there, and we kind of anticipated this issue. So when we asked for the 23 new FTEs, that was in our mind. Now, will that be sufficient? I can better answer that question for you in 2 years. We anticipated doing some of this work when we requested those 23 FTEs, but there may be some additional manpower needs. What we really want to get to is some type of self-certification system where people know what the standards are. They have an engineer, maybe a professional engineer, certified that they followed the standards when they put this pipe in the ground. And then that, of course, creates a definite liability on their part if something happens and those standards weren't followed. But we're still going to have to do some inspection and enforcement to make sure that the folks that are signing off on these really did follow the rules.
One of the things that you alluded to this, but one of the things that I would imagine is obviously quite important to landowners is to what extent who has liability when a pipeline breaks, or if a pipeline is not installed correctly, or if there is some kind of pipeline problem?
Well, the way the law works right now is the owner of the pipeline has an absolute liability to clean up or reclaim the effects of that break or that leak. But there's a problem there in that there isn't always really a responsible party, and they can go bankrupt. They can transfer ownership. There are ways to legally get around that absolute responsibility. So a big important part of some legislation that moved through the legislature this year was to change the reclamation fund to make this a part of it, and to add a tremendous amount of funding to it, so that if we run into a situation where there's no responsible party, there will be state funding available to make sure that the repair is made and the reclamation takes place.
Where's that funding coming from?
That funding is going to come from 4% of 1% of the oil extraction tax.
All right.
And that will be taken directly into the abandoned well pipeline and site restoration fund, which will be capped at $75 million.
Do you think that that's enough money?
Well, we think so. We ran the numbers based on the number of idle wells we've had and the number of pipeline breaks and that sort of thing, and projected it out to a situation where we're at 45 or 50,000 well bores, and that's how we arrived at $75 million. So we think it's the right number. It can be adjusted in the future if it's not. 50,000
well bores is a lot, of course, and one of the issues that you've probably heard quite a bit about is, to what extent do you think that the surface owner who does not necessarily own mineral rights to the oil that's being produced beneath the land that he or she owns, to what extent are these people fairly compensated for the trouble they go through for hosting oil development that they do not profit directly from?
Well, that's a great question, and of course you threw in the word fair. And
I know that's a real four-letter word.
Yeah, exactly. Let me kind of start by drawing a picture for you. North Dakota is 90% privately owned. So we're unique amongst the oil states. I guess Texas is the only one that has more private ownership, less federal and state, but we're 90% privately owned. What has happened, though, over the decades since the 1930s is that about 80% of those minerals have transferred to someone other than the surface owner. So only in about one case out of 5 does that surface owner also own the minerals. So we've got most of our surface owners out there are just surface owners, and so it's a very difficult situation to justly compensate those people for the impacts that they're going to suffer. We've made a lot of progress. I don't think we're all the way there. We're working on trying to find the right compensation mode for pipeline easements, and we think that these regulations are going to help ease surface owners' concerns about pipelines. We've also moved to a system where we do annual compensation for the loss of productivity of the land. But are we all the way there? I seriously doubt it. I think we've got more work to do in that area. You know, I heard of a lot of situations where Grandpa settled surface damages on an oil well for a truck. And now the current surface owner can look at that old rusty truck sitting out in the tree belt, and that's all the compensation he gets for that well that we all thought would be there for 15 years, but it's now 60 years old. And so we don't really know the life of these Bakken wells exactly. And so moving to an annual compensation system was a really important piece. But there's more work to be done in terms of finding that correct compensation formula. And another big part of getting there was moving this into the mediation system within the ag department. That really offers something other than going to court for those surface owners. And we needed to offer them something besides going to district court and suing the oil company.
One of the things that that I wanted you to respond to, I've heard this a lot, and it's been said a lot that, you know, there's oil production going on in certain areas that are considered to be like pristine wilderness and places that maybe oil development it's a bit problematic as to whether it should be occurring. And there are statements made as that, oh, if this happens, then the land is ruined. And I was thinking, well, these oil wells are not going to be there forever. So how is the land permanently ruined if something is not going to be there forever? I guess the question I'm getting to is, once an oil well doesn't produce any more oil, what happens to that site according to state law and regulation?
Yes.
I mean, it isn't like the pump jack sits there forever, is it?
No. There are cases where it sits there for such a long period of time, people get very impatient. But you have to understand, too, that those people acquired a property right in that property, and you can't just go take their property without due process. So we go through a lot of due process to get that done. North Dakota has some of the most progressive reclamation standards of any state. We did not preserve topsoil prior to 1981. So there are out there on the landscape about half of the wells that have been reclaimed and the bond released. The total number is 8,427 as of yesterday that have been reclaimed and the bond released. About half of those were drilled before topsoil was preserved. And there is an enormous difference between those wells and the modern well where we preserve the topsoil. And the rule change that we made about 4 years ago saying you must restore the contours of the land and you have to restore the vegetative growth. So our rules require preservation of the topsoil, restoration of the contours, putting the topsoil back, and then restoring growth of the vegetation before the bond can be released.
Mr. Coons, you represent landowners who have experience with oil development. Did you have any particular issues you wanted to raise?
I guess this session we had a bill for reclamation, more specific standards. In the coal industry, you could see how that started out and how it's changed. We're looking for something more specific like that that'll deal with your amount of topsoil for site-specific, your compaction, your conductivity, your salts, your foreign materials, getting it so when this is done that can be put back to par. So the people carrying the burden on this are treated fairly. We all have the dream of prosperity from Grand Forks to Williston, but with that, we need to think of those who are carrying much of the burden, and that's the surface owners. I see there's a lot more that needs to be done on the reclamation end, and we're hoping to be involved with Lynn's department in the rulemaking here to have input on that.
What sort of standards are you looking for reclamation?
Well, something that'll be more site-specific, because if you look at the soils and the terrain and everything in the Badlands compared to, say, the Des Lacs River area, or you look at the Watford City area, drastic differences. So you need to bring it back to that so it'll be proper for the native rangeland or crop production. Also, we were looking at with this that, how you say, the compensation that people are getting nowadays, are not going to cover that in the end. So it's got to be more equitable to them. If you have a farm and you have a pivot and an oil site gets put in and it inhibits the movement of the pivot, how is that compensated? Or you have a feed lot, or you put in a $400,000 home and a $600,000 shop, and you have a oil site 500 feet away with the flares and such now will be further away. The value of that home, is it still $400,000 and $600,000, or is it $300,000 and $200,000? How are they compensated? Because there's a lot of talk that goes into the mineral owner's rights, but you don't hear nearly as much about the surface owner. With the right of ingress, we're worrying about, not limiting their access to their minerals, but the surface owner's paying the burden for that.
Mr. Helms, what do you think of that analysis?
Well, I think Troy is talking about some really valuable ideas about moving forward with reclamation and compensation. We often hear the comparisons between the coal mining reclamation laws versus the oil and gas reclamation rules. Coal mining regulated by OSM, a federal law, and then the local laws. There's a huge difference between a strip mine and an oil well site. In our case, we're taking 5 to 30 acres out of production for a period of time. We almost never dig below 20 feet, whereas with a coal mine, you're taking entire quarter sections or thousands of acres out of production for a decade, and you're removing the entire soil system, groundwater system, everything, and then trying to restore it. We try to go with good science behind what we find when we get there, how much topsoil and what the contours look like, and then try to restore that at the end of the life of the well. One benefit we have is it's a small enough tract that you can go and sample all around it, and you hang on to the bond until that piece of land that well was on produces the same kind of crop or the same kind of pasture as on the four sides of it. Wasn't always that way in the past. I understand that. Bonds were released when the soil wasn't as productive as the surface owner wanted to have it. And again, I think we can do better as we move forward in terms of soil science and understanding that. I think 2 years ago, restored the position of reclamation supervisor, and I went and got a fellow from NDSU whose specialty is in soils. He's a geologist who specialized in soils, and put him into that position because it is that important to the Industrial Commission.
One of the things that I imagine you have to balance is that you are a regulator. Your agency is a regulator of the oil industry, and also it is, frankly, a promoter of oil production. And how do you balance those competing interests and make landowners feel as if they're not being big-footed by oil companies?
That's a great question, and I've often smiled when I read our mission statement in 380801 because it contains all those words about
it says
encouraging. Yeah, no, it doesn't say
okay.
Bigfoot, but
okay.
it says encourage and promote, and it says regulate, and so that is a major task. What I have tried to do is have an individual or a department whose sole job is regulation. And I've got an assistant director, and he runs the oil and gas division, and they're supposed to stick with the job of regulating. That's about 2/3 of my current staff. Then I've got another 1/3 of my staff who is supposed to deal with promotion, and that's the state geologist and his geologists and that, and I assist them a fair amount in that. I'm supposed to be the one person that straddles that fence. Coming out of this legislative session, if things continue on the path I see, we're actually going to end up 80% regulatory and 20% promotional. So we're moving in the right direction in terms of what the Bakken and Three Forks are doing to us. But that has been my approach to that, is to try to use the Geological Survey and its resources to promote and encourage, and try to use the oil and gas division to regulate. And we've only been doing that since 2005. So once again, that's when the merger of the two took place. And so once again, it's a fairly new project or new job that we're doing. And are we achieving it perfectly? Clearly not. But that's our goal.
We have about a minute left. What are the trends here, Mr. Helms? I mean, we hear a lot about housing shortages and labor shortages. Are these starting to abate a bit?
Yes, they are. Let me kind of, when we entered this legislative session, we wanted to get a feel for that. And so I had my district supervisors who are in Minot, Williston, and Dickinson do a housing survey. And interestingly enough, what they discovered was that we're about caught up on hotel rooms. We were starting to see hotel rates drop and some vacancy in hotel rooms. But we're nowhere near caught up on apartments, and we're not caught up on single-family housing at all. Our projections indicate that we're going to need a whole nother biennium to get there on apartments or rental space, and we're probably going to need 2 bienniums to get there in terms of single-family dwellings. And
we've been speaking to Lynn Helms. He's the director of the Department of Mineral Resources in North Dakota. We also have with us as a guest Mr. Troy Coons, the vice chairman of the Northwest Landowners Association. This is Dale Wetzel. This is the Legislature Today.
KFYR, K-Fire.
America's Mattress Bismarck is #1 in the nation in sales and customer satisfaction out of over 400 store locations. We are now open in front of North Walmart. Large